Welcome, everyone, to the NEANE Lecture Series. My name is Patricia Menezes, and I'm one of the organizers of this project, together with my colleague, Claudia Matos Evelise. This series is the result of a partnership between NEANE, which is the Study Center for Non-European Art at the University of Campinas, Unicamp, and Tufts University. And it has the support of the Getty Foundation through their Connecting Art Histories program. So before we can start our activities today, just a reminder that you will be able to ask questions after the lecture, and you can simply write them at the comment section on the YouTube channel, and we can select them and pass on to our guest today. So now I'll call my colleague Claudia so she can present our very distinguished guest for this evening. So please, Claudia.
Thank you, Patricia. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much, Emily, for being here with us today. It's a pleasure to present all of you my colleague, Emily Gephart, who is a lecturer at the Department of Visual and Material Studies at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts University. She is specialized in art and visual culture of the United States, with an emphasis on ecocriticism and the history of perceptual psychology. Dr. Gephart has published widely about 19th and 20th century visual culture and ecology, and her recent book, Ecocriticism and the Anthropocene in the 19th Century, Art and Visual Culture, published with Maura Colling, is already like a special reference in the field. Thank you so much, Emily, for being here, and I'll pass you the word.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you so much, Patricia. It's a real pleasure, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak with you today. So I'd like to spend some time today, when my presentation is visible. I can't see. Okay, great. Fantastic. There we are. That's what I'm talking about. I'd like to share a few examples of how some Indigenous North American artists working in the 21st century are finding ever new ways to challenge long-standing misperceptions about what it means to be an Indigenous artist and what it means to work within the context of culturally specific traditions. Now, I need to acknowledge that my own heritage is not Indigenous, and that I cannot speak to the true complexity of Native American identity. My vantage point is also shaped, of course, by my own blind spots and my own preconceptions. This is also, I will say, new work that I have embarked upon fairly recently that have grown out of some courses that I have been teaching at the Visual and Material Studies Department at Tufts, which I hope to expand upon in upcoming projects. So I thank you all for giving me the opportunity to test some of this material for you all today. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So despite many remarkable efforts on the part of some museums and curators to reposition how Native American art is conceptualized, such as the groundbreaking 2019 show called Hearts of Our People, Native women artists at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, a lot of non-Indigenous folks across the United States and Canada all too often retain a very circumscribed or stereotyped idea about what Indigenous art does and should look like. Now, some may picture it, as you may see it here on the left, in the context of ethnographic museum displays of material culture. This kind of vitrine that you see here is a staple of many different museums that are devoted to preserving Native traditions as if these are always located in some remote and long-vanished past. Here, the work of unidentified makers of so-called artifacts are presented as relics or as encapsulations of Indigenous crafts and lifeways that have supposedly been lost amid long-standing suppression and erasure of Native American culture. Other misperceptions in a different vein may think of Indigenous art primarily within the context of culture tourism, imagining artisans crafting blankets and baskets and beadwork to be sold as souvenirs at specialist galleries or at trading posts located on or near reservation lands in the United States and Canada, or at native-run casinos. Contemporary multidisciplinary artist Merritt Johnson evokes this stereotype by remarking that most people only think of beads and feathers when they think of Native American art. And this attitude may also facilitate the ready appropriation of motifs and materials that are coded as Native American and consequently exoticized, performed, or valued as signifiers of some fetishized concept of cultural authenticity. Both of these two models of regarding the work of Indigenous artists result from deeply rooted policies of settler colonial dispossession and assimilation. As treaties were broken in the 19th century, Native peoples were removed from their homelands and denied sovereignty, contained on reservations, and often refused the right to exercise their cultural practices. If I might have the next slide, please. When generations of Native children in the United States and Canada were sent to government-run schools throughout the 19th and into the 20th centuries, they were often forbidden to speak their Indigenous languages and were forced to conform to the beliefs and behaviors of mainstream Anglo-American society. When young people were severed from their families, their languages, and their cosmologies, and trained in a limited number of cultural practices, many traditions were put under threat. Some training in commercially marketable traditions like Anishinaabe beadwork or Navajo weaving did support the perpetuation of Indigenous art forms. But at the same time, other vital practices were suppressed or disregarded, and the deeper spiritual or cultural meanings of these practices were sometimes pared away. On some reservations, makers did support themselves and their communities by reinterpreting traditional arts, creating objects as souvenirs that could and did sell very well among dealers in Native American craft, catering to the so-called Indian craze of the late 19th and early 20th century among white collectors. Yet the policy of cultural assimilation was bound up in paradox. While schools enforced a model of homogenization, the discourses of modernist primitivism policed the comparative and hierarchical boundaries of what counted as authentic Indigenous art and culture. Any forms of hybridization or cultural mingling or fluid transit between history and modernity were seen as evidence of Indigenous cultural decline and entangled in 19th century social Darwinist narratives in which vanishing Indians were presumably doomed to perish. Thus, by the early 20th century, white anthropologists and art collectors eagerly acquired the pieces of Native American art which now fill the halls and vitrines of museums, and they adorned their homes with artistic products that, to them, signified a threatened ideal of Native American cultural purity and stasis. One legacy of the disavowal of living traditions was the habit of pigeonholing Indigenous North American art and artists, allowing them to be seen as if trapped in some mythic past in which true authenticity was felt to reside. Aside from being both generalizing and demeaning, this belief also failed to acknowledge the dynamism that had long distinguished the ongoing work of artists and the unique individual expression that continued to emerge between and within different Indigenous communities, as well as more broadly and more recently across an ever-expanding global contemporary culture. Conflating Native American traditions or seeing all Indigenous artists as uniformly allied with the beads and feathers aesthetic not only disregards diversity, but effectively silences Native American voices by denying them the capacity of all culture to evolve. Next slide, please. Luiseno multimedia and performance artist James Luna challenged these paradigms of conflation, containment, and display in his 1987 performance and installation entitled Artifact Piece, which he staged first in San Diego, California, at the anthropological institution that was then called the Museum of Man. It was restaged in New York in 1990. In this act, Luna made a potent commentary about the colonialist objectification of Native American culture via methods affiliated with salvage anthropology on the one hand, or with the elusive goal of securing a sense of authenticity on the other. And here Luna put his own body on display in a glass case as a means of making a critical intervention. Here he lay a living man wearing a loincloth and lying surrounded by didactic labels. These pointed out scars he had suffered in fights when he had been drunk and combative, addressing a prominent stereotype and problematic fact about rates of alcoholism among many Native peoples. But in adjoining cases, he also displayed various personal items and ritual objects still used on the La Jolla reservation where the artist resided. These included Motown records, a Sex Pistols record, and Rolling Stones cassettes, a toy car, political buttons, sneakers, his college diploma, and his divorce papers, all labeled and set out as if relics of a vanishing race. The curious mixture of display strategies revealed a living, flawed, and developing individual whose culture was as alive and dynamic as he was at the time himself. He died in 2018. Artifact Piece addressed so many of the key themes that Indigenous artists of Luna's own generation were struggling with, including problems of representation in popular culture and in the art world, and revealing how these systems foreclosed any contemporary Indigenous agency. An important part of Luna's resistance to this pernicious objectification was his insistence on experiences with popular culture, like his ironic sculptural assemblage entitled High-Tech Peace Pipe, created for use during a performance at the Institute of the American Indian Art in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The artist himself noted, and I quote, "I came up with a story that deals with what we Indians as survivors endure and how we've been able to survive by making do with what we've been given or what we have left to us. The metal plumbing pipe presented a byproduct of having to make do with a diminished supply of pipestone." And here we see it attached to a now obsolete telephone technology. Luna went on to embrace many other aspects of modernity, not as signs of assimilation, but as aspects of his experience as a living, vital, and contemporary Indigenous person. Next slide, please. A host of younger artists in the 21st century are picking up on the challenges that Luna's project initiated, making work that reconfigures what it means to delve into the complexities of Indigenous identity and tradition, while also being wholly engaged in the problems and joys and contradictions of living right now. While I can't hope to mention all of the artists who are engaging with this broad project, in today's talk, I draw attention to a few whose work pushes material and process beyond any traditional expected limits, who also negotiate between enduring and culturally specific forms of knowledge and the demands of a changing world. Now, I recognize here that the concept of tradition itself is extremely malleable, and that my selection of artists and traditions is somewhat arbitrary. In fact, I take my cue in part from the very stereotypes that remain most prevalent about Indigenous art, beads, baskets, and blankets among them, in order to subvert these prejudices. Whether they work in the United States or in Canada, Indigenous artists across North America negotiate the legacy of settler colonialism and the still turbulent political landscapes in which relations between First Nations and Native peoples and governmental systems remain fractured. In their work, they stake out terrain in which identity and practices may align in seeking ways of decolonizing the art world. Next slide, please. The first artist I will mention is Jeffrey Gibson, who's an affiliated member of the Mississippi, Choctaw, and Cherokee Nations, who's created a dazzling body of work while operating within the fault lines of his multifaceted identity as a Native American, a gay man, and a contemporary artist, navigating the stereotypes that people have about all. Gibson filters what the larger world might imagine as traditional techniques or media like beading and weaving, rawhide, and fringe, through his experience as a queer artist. His work has often taken the form of sculpture or tapestry, but it also incorporates video, drawing, painting, and collage, all of which help to situate trauma within the histories of his overlapping cultures, but which reconfigures heritage as a force that is not only thriving and dynamic, but also jubilant. His work is bright and colorful and brimming with wry humor, and Gibson likes to defy conventions with apparent joy. The artist's work have been forged between and among the various forms of community and kinship with which he takes part, and features many different kinds of collaborations. His sculptures and tapestries speak to the experience of forging subjectivity amid a broader narrative of globalization. He's known best for his appropriations of found objects and media references and commercial commodities, which might range from 1980s pop song lyrics to literal objects such as punching bags, in order to engage in a revisionist history, a repurposing of cherished modernist forms and techniques, and a reconfiguration of art historical codes, blended with references to his own lineage that lends them pattern and form. Gibson first captured the attention of the art world with brightly patterned tapestries and sculptural pieces, some displaying distorted human figures emblazoned with cryptic slogans. In his works, these statements blend and overlap with words of familiar songs, like the 1978 disco anthem, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, which you can see in the text at left, whose catchy dance beats are evoked by the colorful shifting geometric patterns. If patterning and text, and sometimes the use of text as patterning, compete for our attention, they also engage a viewer in deciphering the layered and multiple messages that Gibson's works can convey. On the right, we see an intricate, outsized ceremonial figure beaded with the enigmatic phrase, people like us, on the right, begging the question, is this meaning people like us or people actually like us, are fond of us? This stands about 5 feet tall, and it's made of glass and plastic beads, nylon fringes, rawhide, and other materials like the copper and gold finished cone-shaped jingles, which often feature on Cherokee dance costumes. The work's designs echo the colors and marks found in some modernist paintings, such as those by Joseph Albers or Frank Stella, but Gibson employs these elements to foreground his own intersectionality and to interweave politics, identity, and artistic references that nod to the past, pay homage to his present, and look forward to a more communitarian future. Next slide, please. For Gibson, art is a vehicle for and a catalyst to activism, drawing attention to the issues with which many different Native peoples across their specific nations still struggle, like access to healthcare and social resources, physical and mental health and substance use disorders, dependency on government, environmental degradation, and the legacy of historical trauma. Almost a decade ago, Gibson's breakout works were a series of punching bags festooned with fringes and beads, which became a cathartic way for him to explore his anger about issues of race, class, and entitlement. They're compelling, they're witty, and they convey a potent sense of the artist's struggle, making a nod to the frustration of being typecast in reductive ways as a Native American and queer artist. The 2- and 3-dimensional works that followed retained those qualities, combating preconceptions by being simultaneously attractive, vaguely threatening, and always dense with layered meanings. Next slide, please. At the heart of Gibson's practice, we might find an embrace of hybridity as part of his reinvention of what tradition might signify, drawing influence from popular entertainment, as well as fashion and literature and critical theory. Gibson recontextualized pop cultural references to offer his own commentary on cultural commingling. At the 2019 Whitney Museum of American Art's biennial show, Gibson's garments hung like banners from the rafters, making reference to similar decorated shirts once associated with the underground ghost dance movement. This subversive spiritual uprising had taken hold among many indigenous nations who were confined to reservations in the late 1800s, and it was a practice banned by the US government. It originated within the Nevada Paiute Nation as a form of ceremony and protest, and the ghost dance movement quickly spread to other Native peoples, who participated in an outpouring of group dancing, believing that this peaceful and spiritual resistance would discourage further white settlement, would cause current settlers to leave or disappear, and furthermore, they believed it would protect Native Americans from the physical harm of guns and other weapons. For Gibson, the legacy of this history retains power. The subtle movement of these garments, while hanging from the ceiling, reminded Whitney visitors of how the regalia worn by ghost dance participants swayed with the dancers' body movements. This updated version of ghost dance attire now references what Gibson calls his own queer club culture, reframing the ghost dance as a form of LGBTQ subversion and resistance. Next slide, please. Beading is also central to Kiowa artist Terry Greaves, who grew up on the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. She learned her Kiowa beading techniques from her grandmother, and even as a child, Terry Greaves observed that her grandmother was able to express herself through beading, and despite working poorly respected jobs as a dishwasher and house cleaner, her grandmother always thought of herself primarily as an artist first. For Greaves, working with beads is about giving voice to her grandmother and other ancestors. She writes, quote, "I'm compelled to do it. I have no choice in the matter. I must express myself and my experience as a 21st century Kiowa, and I do it like all those unknown artists before me through my medium, which may be considered craft or traditional, yet my stories come from the same source as the voice running through the first Kiowa beadworkers' needles." Greaves brings this cultural history into dialogue with contemporary objects, as in the case of her sneaker series, in which she combines motifs from geometric Kiowa beadwork garments like the high moccasins traditionally worn by women with figurative elements. Along with the vividly colored glass and bugle beads, Greaves's designs are made with cabochon shells and Swarovski crystals, which add three-dimensionality and bling to these wearable sculptures. Greaves echoes Jeffrey Gibson in her hybridization of hip-hop culture and indigenous practices. As she says, and I quote her again, "I found a way to use the materials and techniques of the old masters and mix them up with new materials and techniques for my generation in an attempt to interpret this 21st century world I live in." Next slide, please. Beading is also crucially important to Carrie Allison, who is of Cree, Métis, and European descent, and who currently lives and works in Nova Scotia, Canada. Where Greaves and Gibson are ebullient in their art forms, Allison's work calls for a lot more meditative response. Her practice is time-intensive, repetitive, durational, and very thoughtful. She uses beading or conceptualizes beading as a ceremonial practice, as well as beads as a material that can connect with histories, narratives, relatives, and ancestors. And these practices respond to her maternal Cree and Métis heritage as she works to think through intergenerational cultural loss and acts of reclaiming resilience and resistance. In what she thinks of as visual discussions, she brings together beading, performance, embroidery, watercolor, websites, QR codes, audio-visual, and most recently, animation. Calling upon the Cree words for kinship and the way in which we all relate to one another, these concepts ground Allison's methodology and serve as her guiding principles. In fact, Allison believes that the threads interwoven through generations recreate the same bodily acts, stitch after stitch. So for the artist, beading is a way of decolonizing Western and hierarchical ways of disseminating knowledge. She sees it as a form of technology and knowledge transfer, even if beading doesn't conform to the definitions or standards set by dominant settler colonial perspectives. Here we're looking at a detail and some examples of work in her Beaded Botanical Series, one of 7 specimen replicas corresponding to plants preserved in the botany collection of the Natural Museum of Natural History in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Allison has intricately replicated endangered native plants of Mi'kmaqui territory in beading as a means of recognizing each plant as a being. They are under threat due to development within the territory, reducing their habitat and endangering their fragile existence. During a 4-month residency at the museum, Allison used making as a form of honoring and beading as a kind of ceremony, thinking through Western scientific practices versus what she posits as alternative indigenous ways of knowing. These pieces are left deliberately unfinished to symbolize the near extinction of the species in the unceded territories of her own First Nations peoples. Next slide. So here I show you 2 other related projects that demonstrates Allison's technological innovations. Combining performance, audio technology, and objecthood, these works think through what it means to get to know or to find understanding by listening to the actions that a person carries out. In the performance entitled, "They Make Things to Make People Remember," and I must confess that I do not speak the indigenous languages that are referenced in the title here, Allison is considering how the action of beading might possibly be used as a mnemonic device for language learning. She later expanded on the connections between gesture and sound to create an introspective audio piece, taking the form of a beaded QR code that can be used by a beholder to connect to an audio recording. Here, Allison references the code and uses the code as a capitalist symbol that can nonetheless express something deeply personal, deeply symbolic, and in essence, anti-capitalist. In doing so, Allison poses a larger question as well, asking, how can we create a world that utilizes tools of oppression for resistance, for rethinking relationality? Next slide, please. In fact, across many respective and distinct cultural backgrounds, a lot of Indigenous artists look for ways of honoring what they envision as a continuum of knowledge, the passing on from one generation to the next, even amid diversifying forms of technology transfer. And for Métis artist Christy Belcourt, this continuum extends far beyond the human world to embrace other forms of kinship that speak deeply to ecological interconnectedness. In this way, Christy Belcourt's work exemplifies how a lot of Indigenous traditions and belief systems have always been premised upon the kinds of ecological relationality that are only dawning upon non-native peoples amid a growing recognition of the stakes of climate crisis. Belcourt does not literally use beads in her vast paintings, but references the appearance of traditional Métis and Ojibwe beadwork in order to posit resistance to the Eurocentric imagination and to envision biodiversity. In the mid-1800s, the Métis and the Ojibwe began creating large quantities of beaded items for sale as souvenirs to white collectors, and because of this, were renowned for intricate and innovative floral beadwork motifs that Belcourt borrows from in her own pictorial language. These motifs combined botanical knowledge with symbolic references to spiritual and cosmological systems. Rendered then by Belcourt in tiny dots of vivid paint, here, the wisdom of the universe features animals and plants that are at risk or on the endangered species list in the artist's native Canada, like the dwarf lake iris, the Kyner blue butterfly, or the cerulean warbler bird. All of these surround a central motif representing the abundant tree of life. Measuring roughly 9.5 feet long and 6.5 feet tall, the wisdom of the universe seems celestial, like a mosaic of biological entities, featuring wild edibles and medicinal herbs that have been used for generations. We see representatives of ginger and blueberries, tansy, sumac, apples, sarsaparilla, cedar, and strawberries among them. Overflowing with a sense of abundance, the painting calls to mind a realm in which indigenous plant knowledge is a kind of reverence. But many of the plants that appear in Belcourt's paintings are also referenced in a companion book written by Belcourt and tribal elders, which is entitled Medicines to Help Us. These track ethnobotanical knowledge among the Métis and other nations of the Central Great Plains that straddle the border between the US and Canada. Rebuilding relationships with these medicinal plants, says Belcourt, is an act of resilience that people can take in the wake of extensive resource extraction and pipeline expansion. Indeed, recent Canadian-sponsored studies of biodiversity across the globe have demonstrated that biodiverse regions are the richest in areas maintained by Indigenous peoples. And in that sense, ongoing preservation and celebration of biodiversity can be a political act of radical optimism. At least that's the way Belcourt considers this. When art becomes a means of extending that optimism from making and beholding to forging commitments required to rethink ecological relationality, it will serve a vital purpose to mobilize action. Next slide, please. So here I move from activist beading to ethnobotanical basketry. Educator and artist Kelly Church here wove a green and copper egg as a metaphor for new life and fertility from the wood fibers used by her own Ottawa and Potawatomi nations forest to emphasize the continuance of cultural teachings. Church, who studied painting and sculpture in college, didn't find her way to the family heritage of black ash basket making until she listened to her grandfather's childhood stories and came to realize the importance of baskets to the many interrelated cultures of the Anishinaabe nations. Thus, she found a means of returning her practices to their roots, which were always deeply innovative in their relationship to materials as well as form. Anishinaabe basket weaving was traditionally the province of women whose capacity to observe and transform materials meant deep knowledge of their potency and their vibrancy. Basket making follows seasonal cycles, which lay out what kind of work can be done and when. The ever inventive practices of a basket maker are governed by what is possible, given a season's patterns of abundance and scarcity. And Church allows her creative goals to be led by the parameters set by ecosystems themselves. But she must also confront the environmental factors that are creating disruptions within the web of life. In fact, this woven vessel recalls the ornate metal, enamel, and gem-encrusted confections of 19th century Fabergé eggs, but it speaks more deeply to Church's own traditions of basket weaving, because she and fellow community members rely upon the finely cut splints from the black ash tree to bring Anishinaabe ecological teachings to life. But after the emerald ash borer, an invasive species of Asian beetle with a copper-colored belly, decimated millions of ash trees, Church became an advocate for preserving this traditional resource. as she has said, and I quote, "I was looking ahead to the future. If we really lose all our ash trees, we lose the tradition that we've held onto for so long. So my life turned to being an activist for saving the ash trees and creating pieces that speak about that story," unquote. Her work and its larger projects address the cultural teachings of church's ancestors and the reliance upon technology to preserve a centuries-old practice. On the exterior of the vessel, copper pieces are intricately interlaced with the wood splints of the ash tree on this green basket, reflecting both the color of the emerald ash borer's belly and the traditionally harvested materials of copper and black ash. Church then inside placed a flash drive and a vial containing an emerald ash borer larva, suggesting to future generations that there are ways to bring back the black ash teachings, if not the black ash species, in case it disappears. Next slide, please. Sarah since has taken some of the techniques used to make traditional chirimaka baskets, such as those created by celebrated weaver Clara Darden in the early 20th century, but updates these to create 2- and 3-dimensional woven pieces using her own photographs, blended with long venerated ancestral designs. She creates symbolically complex imagery by weaving digital photographs in order to explore the legacy and the dissolution of the craft skills specific to her heritage. But through her own extensive travel and research, she evokes those of other indigenous communities across the world. Raised in Sacramento, California, Sense's maternal grandmother is Choctaw from Oklahoma, while her maternal grandfather is Chirimaka from Louisiana. From her grandmother, she gained a love of baskets and an interest in practicing the technique. And then with the blessing of the chairman of the Chirimaka tribe, Sense began practicing these variations on traditional methods during her graduate school study. She's since traveled extensively to learn a lot more about the artwork and the basket making techniques of indigenous people all over the world. These 2 images are from her Weaving Water series, which focuses on coastal scenery, seascapes, and island imagery, addressing the migration of peoples who must cross rivers or oceans, and the resulting dilution, hybridity, resilience, and evolution of culture and identity. So to create this body of work, the artist dug deeply into indigenous traditions on the islands of the Caribbean and across Southeast Asia, taking pictures of locations in which she found herself immersed in this research. After printing and splinting the resulting images, the dynamic manipulated photographic pictures are literally then woven together, coordinating these different domains. As coastlines dissolve into traditional patterns, blending with other water imagery, Sense calls forth the experiences of colonization and cultural diaspora, showing how diverse perspectives can both coexist and clash with one another. Next slide, please. Weaving of another kind interests Diné artist Melissa Cody, who is a 4th-generation weaver of traditional Navajo woolen blankets and tapestries. Her practices investigate the methods and materials long maintained by the women of her clans and throughout Diné culture. Growing up around a vibrant community of female weavers, she was exposed to herding and shearing sheep, to carding and spinning wool, and learning to weave in the traditional motifs for which her peoples had secured an early reputation for authentic primitivist form among 19th and 20th century collectors. Yet, if these works reckon with long-standing motifs and symbols, they retain a connection to history. Cody's works are far from the conventional blankets that tourists still seek out in the southwestern states of the United States. They encompass Cody's distinctive interpretation of the grammar of Diné weaving, and her credo that an artist needs to know the rules in order to effectively break them. Her intricate, vivid works borrow their form from the so-called Germantown Revival, which was a 19th century stylistic movement named after the US government-supplied wool shipped from Germantown, Pennsylvania, and supplied to the Diné during a time of their dispossession and sequestration on reservation land. These shipments were a means of encouraging the production of commercially saleable works. This weaving style was characterized, therefore, by complex interaction between traditional methods and historical contingencies. Commercial, bright aniline dyes and new economic pressures prompted enterprising weavers to adapt and create bold new textiles that white collectors loved to acquire. The commercial viability of these practices became what Chippewa scholar Gerald Visner has described as survivance, the capacity to endure, to survive, and to recreate cultural traditions even in the face of their forced dispersal. As new factors changed time-honored practices, these became an art form that remained vibrant and dynamic. So Cody's work carries that balance of tradition, history, and contemporaneity forward. Working on a customary loom, she recombines heritage patterns into sophisticated geometric overlays and haptic, dazzling color schemes. Her subject matter is attuned to up-to-date themes like neuroscientific imaging and brain chemistry. In Good Luck, on the right-hand side, she employs a classic Navajo motif known as the whirling log, which is a customary symbol of good fortune. Although most recognizable today, unfortunately, as a swastika, Cody seeks to reclaim that problematic symbol in a defiantly exuberant palette, encircling it in another Diné motif, the rainbow person, who is a protective figure. As if to underscore the playful quality of the work, Cody renders the rainbow person like it's an extension cord, the face taking the form of a socket, and the two bottom legs, the plug. The tight weave of the textile creates sharply defined borders around the pixelated lettering, reading "Good Luck." And as Cody has pointed out, these pixels seem innate to her. As she has remarked, quote, "I'm a child of the 1980s video game culture, Pac-Man, Frogger, Nintendo. I grew up within a world of pixelation." Cody thus approaches weaving as an ever-evolving art form capable of encompassing a transformational repertoire of designs, motifs, ideas, and references. Next slide. Heiltsuk artist Sean Hunt also engages with an underlying theme of transformation in Indigenous art, but he blends spiritual references to hybrid animal-human entities with the transformative potential of the most up-to-date virtual reality devices. Hunt seeks to circumvent contentious discussions about the relative value of Indigenous authenticity by launching new forms of dialogue past these moribund conversations. Thus, his work gives beholders a digitally enhanced sidelong glimpse of an Indigenous ceremonial world of experience, inviting them to think more deeply about what truly counts as tradition. Hunt's work demonstrates some of the underlying design principles of Northwest Coast Indigenous peoples by expanding upon longstanding forms and experimenting with new fabrication techniques. In his performances and installations, visitors encounter a sleek black robotic raven mask, its plastic 3D printed beak and head highlighted with strips of bright LED lights. Its eyes are cell phone screens, animated with emotive red pupils as if the Heiltsuk trickster figure Raven has taken on the guise of a 1980s-era cyborg. But the form and structure of Hunt's mask is based on historic Northwest Coast transformation masks, which were part of the ceremonia regalia used in dances by many peoples across the region. Such masks captured the imagination of late 19th century Euro-American artists and anthropologists with their ingenious construction. By pulling on a series of drawstrings that were concealed within the mask, the wearer can pull the beak apart to theatrically reveal another face and another spiritual entity hidden inside. Next slide, please. In Hunt's transformation masks, he updates what such transformations might involve, conveying a sense of the transgressive possibility of technology. As viewers peer inside the mask, they watch the sculpture and its wearer morph into a technologically sophisticated human-animal hybrid. Motors bring the mask to life as it opens its beak, revealing a person inside, their face lit with a red glow, looking through the glass of augmented reality holographic lenses. Thus, this mask is meant for visitors to interact with. Its enactment of digital transformation in a gallery seeks to emulate and update the experience of dancing and wearing a transformation mask. As Hunt himself says, and again I quote, "The mask is about bridging, and my intent is to bring the non-Indigenous viewer into that cultural world." He continues, "When you go to look at masks, you're generally going to a gallery or museum, and in that context, the masks are not masks, but sculptures, and not something you can wear or interact with," unquote. But in his installations, Hunt sees transformation masks in general as a kind of an interface. In his words again, quote, "They're an interface with the unseen, whether this is the spirit world or the world of the internet." And then through these creations, a viewer might briefly inhabit another experience, another world, or possibly make contact with another cultural realm. Next slide, please. Nicholas Gallinen is another artist connected to the peoples and practices of the Northwest Coast. and is a Tlingit Uganaksh artist whose work offers a perspective rooted in connection to land and to broad engagement with contemporary issues. He employs varied materials and processes to set up dialogue about what artistic production is and how it might be capable of envisioning new possibilities. Galanin is a conceptual artist as much as one who works with traditional methods, and he allows his overriding interest in concepts to determine which materials or processes he will borrow from. So his practice is not only object-based, but includes numerous collaborations with fellow visual and recording artists. Galanin works primarily from within his own lived experience as a person who inhabits mixed ancestry, engaging in the complexities of contemporary and ever-fluid Indigenous identity and representation. Here, in I Think It Goes Like This, he challenges a viewer to reassemble the pieces of a deconstructed, mass-produced totem pole, the kind of object manufactured in Indonesia, but sold in gift shops throughout Sitka, Alaska, where the artist lives and works. The project makes reference to the appropriation and commodification of Native culture, as well as to the decimation of Indigenous knowledge, referencing at the same time motifs that are familiar to him and to his background and heritage. Next slide, please. From his original background in silver jewelry work, Galanin has expanded into sculpture, performance, and recording. But even when working with materials or motifs that are coded as traditional, Galanin enacts a deeper give and take with history, tracking ways that Indigenous people have been displaced, often through violent means, regarding how Indigenous culture across North America has so often been appropriated. This pair of iron handcuffs is intricately engraved by Galanin with Tlingit designs, and it's a work that he calls Indian children's bracelets. Here, Galanin specifically references the separation of families through Native American boarding schools. But as the artist explains, the work can also function as a strident critique on the one hand, or an expression of selective amnesia. As he says, and again I quote, "Someone will look at these children's bracelets, and if they just want to look at the surface, they'll see the engraving and they'll see a Tlingit art form that they might appreciate, but they may not see the full object or the history that the object tells," unquote. Yet Galanin considers all of his works potential vessels for challenging knowledge and the limits of tradition. Culture and technology are inherently political for him, but amid the criticism embedded in these objects, they also offer a spirit of evocative repurposing. Next slide, please. Galanin is also a musician and recording artist on the Sub Pop label, whose interests bridge the seemingly disparate worlds of pop music and traditional dance. The video projection here on screen, I'm showing you, of course, only stills, translates as "We will again open this container of wisdom that has been left in our care," and it has two parts. In the first episode, you hear the pounding, infectious beats of electronic music composed by Galanin, which inspires the performance of traditional Tlingit dancer Dan Littlefield. Masked and dressed in full regalia, carrying a raven rattle, Littlefield moves to the new beat in old ways. But in the second sequence, viewers hear the drumming and chanting of traditional Tlingit vocals and drums, which could be an archival soundtrack recorded over 100 years ago. But here, dancer David Elsewhere Bernal is seen in an empty studio dressed in street-savvy attire, breakdancing to old songs in very new ways. The result is a mesmerizing revelation of the dynamism of culture, able at once to embrace innovation and maintain integrity. Of course, what stays the same across both videos is the power of the beat, an element found across so many cultures and times, perhaps evoking the beat of our own hearts and signaling a sign of life and vitality. Thus, in this project, the pulse of Indigenous lifeways gestures again towards survivance, taking on engaging new forms. Next slide, please. The last artist I'll talk about today is Maria Hupfield, because Galanin is not alone in interweaving issues relating to the preservation of music, dance, and language about the ironic reversal of still circulating stereotypes about Indigenous identity. Conceptual interdisciplinary artist Maria Hupfield is also an Anishinaabe creator interested in embodied practices, and her movement-based performances tell stories grounded in archival, socio-political, artistic, and spiritual narratives. Her video projection, Survival and Other Acts of Defiance, depicts the artist jumping up and down, wearing boots adorned with jingle beads on an endless loop, setting the bells into a steady rhythm. A large X on the floor in front of the projection invites the viewer to join in and jump in solidarity with the artist. Across many similar interactive installations, Hupfield seeks to produce shared moments that open space for conversations to emerge in exchange with beholders. These moments of connection are often grounded in objects. Hupfield's hand-sewn industrial felt creations are material mashups that can be used or sometimes worn on the body and are meant to generate a rich sensorial encounter. All our relations in four directions on the right gestures towards the dynamic sonic aspects of Hupfield's practice. It is a speaker stand that features neon antlers, ribbons, and a felt bag. The exuberant colors highlight a rupture from customary museum practices, which may visually categorize Indigenous artists by painting galleries in dark colors, a practice that denotes primitivist or colonial notions of Indigenous earthiness. Hupfield's colors are vibrant, neon, and bright. Her projects reject the essentialization of indigeneity and the commodification of nativeness, and indeed rejects the fetishized exoticism that may surround products made under the rubric of traditions. Living as an off-reservation member of the affiliated Anishinaabe peoples, Hupfield sees herself as both a citizen of the techno-savvy world and a maker embedded in her background. She pairs attention to materiality and design with a sense of the power possessed by interactive objects to enact world building and to create space for intentionality, agency, and an ethics devoted to care. Transforming everyday objects into new assemblages, she employs these not as ready-mades for contemplation, but seeks to convey a deeper sense of vitality to what often may seem dry, obtuse, or minimalist in much contemporary conceptual art. Yet her projects call for a deeper, encompassing sense of integrated relationality among all entities with which we share the planet, borrowing the title All Our Relations from a Lakota word. This project thus resists the mythification of Indigenous beliefs, situating in a world that coexists with music, technology, dance, wearables, and the various collectives with and through which people find themselves making community. By focusing today on individual artists who make the kinds of objects amenable to existing art world structures, I realize that I'm presenting at best a partial picture, and one that may only reflect the long dominant paradigms of exhibition and collecting. So I've not had a chance here to address the collectives of Indigenous artists working to reconfigure what it means to be both an artist and an activist, and whose projects challenge customary habits of art world commodification more deeply. The many artists pursuing alternate means of invoking communitarian traditions through collaboration or through non-object-based works offer an alternate model of repurposing heritage and deserve more time than I have today. Nonetheless, among the artists that I've highlighted, their varied gestures of radical repurposing of traditions accompanies a far deeper restructuring of what it means to inhabit identity and to rethink relationality for the 21st century. I see these artists leading the way for many others who may not share their Indigenous heritage, but who are similarly working dynamically across intersectional arenas, reshaping the ground on which the entire idea of tradition may itself be built and understood. Thank you so much for listening to me today.
Thank you so much, Emily, for this amazing presentation.
Thank you.
Now we are open for questions. I don't know if Claudia wants to start with some commentary maybe while...
Yeah. Well, I'll start. Thank you, Emily. And I'm so happy to know that you are working in this direction and thinking about topics that are many, like close to the discussions that I think about in Brazil. So I think this is a great opportunity to think comparatively. And I love the way you finish your talk, because the whole time I was basically reflecting on how these artists connect to the question of the market. And which is, I think, a real big question for contemporary Indigenous artists today in Brazil as well. I don't know how this goes in the US, but in Brazil, it has been like very sudden that they were incorporated in a really kind of rapid way to the market, and set in the highlights of things. And I feel that this kind of brought many questions to them, relating to where they want to be connected, if they want to be connected to their communities, or if they want to be like out in the global art scene, or is it possible to do both things? And so, yeah, I'm really curious about where these artists, because it seems like maybe in the US, they are much more like highly educated, and some of them grew within, like come from, I don't know, high education in art, or have always been in the market. And my curiosity is, how do they connect to the communities that are like in reservations, or how does this map out in the US, if that is an issue as well or not?
It is, and absolutely, these artists, each one has a commitment to their families, their broader communities, both on the reservation where many of them were raised, but not all of them, and many have a sense of really needing to be part of both worlds, or having the privilege to be part of both worlds, because as you observed, quite a few of them do have well-educated fine arts backgrounds, which are very savvy and which are quite familiar with the dynamics of the market. And in part, I chose to focus on those artists because many of them seem to be quite self-aware of the delicate balance that they need to trace between addressing the commodification of Indigenous art, which is part of its long history, and seeking to, in a very visible way, like Jeffrey Gibson, challenge those paradigms and embrace them in order to overturn them. But each and every one of them, as an individual, has a slightly different relationship to what it means to be part of a reservation culture, or to owe a debt to reservation culture. And some are a lot more self-aware and self-conscious, and address the fact, as Maria Hupfield does, about being an Anishinaabe person who's got a connection to the reservation, but who sees herself as an off-reservation, very urban maker, which again sort of overturns the preconception that all Native Americans must and always live on and be connected to the reservation. Melissa Cody as well is an artist whose presence and practice is so indebted to her reservation heritage, and yet as a contemporary artist has the good fortune of being able to be a citizen of the world, traveling around and doing residencies, and really benefiting from the many structures of the art world that are expanding opportunities, not just for Indigenous artists, but for all artists to occupy a globalized kind of arena for practicing.
Yeah. Do we have questions?
Yes, we do. Okay. So now we have a question from Silvia Bottinelli. Thanks for a great talk. To expand on your point about collective authorship, can you speak to the role of participation and collaboration for some of the artists that you discussed?
Well, many of them are not only known for their own work as individuals, but known for their collaborations as well. And I think specifically of Nicholas Galinon, who's so engaged not only as a maker of objects and a maker of what he considers to be these sort of vessels of historical give and take, but as a recording artist, as a dancer, his practices never cease to amaze me, because they don't stop at any boundary. They just keep going in terms of addressing other people to work with, other artists to work with, other members of his own community in Sitka, Alaska, but extending and expanding across the various places that he's invited to work. Similarly, Jeffrey Gibson is also an artist who I know is very, very committed to his own practice, but also to sharing that practice and to using that idea of exchange as a way of, on the one hand, demonstrating the very specific identity that is his alone, but also seeing identity and seeing community as something that invites the idea of learning from one another. So the kind of cross-pollination, the kind of hybridization that was so problematically shut down by modernists who were seeking to police the boundaries of cultural autonomy.
Perfect. I would personally have a question, if I may. I found it very interesting that you sort of chose to deal with the stereotypes, or artists that chose to specifically address stereotypes like the use of beads and feathers. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about one of these stereotypes, because we have the same thing in Brazil as well, which is the ecological aspect, the idea that indigenous peoples are somehow expected to deal with ecological issues, and it's always this is also, I think, a case where you have these two possibilities of embracing it in your own personal hybrid way, but also questioning what often seems like a clear instrumentalization of indigenous identities in order to almost put this ecological preservation discourses as a burden to them. Like we are the ones that have to take care of that somehow.
There's so much tension and ambivalence built into that, because on the one hand, as Jessica Horton and many other scholars have pointed out, there is something that is kind of built into so many indigenous cosmologies that contemporary eco-critical scholars are sort of recognizing in retrospect, well, yes, indigenous cultures have always already been eco-critical and have always practiced these models of what Jessica Horton calls, ecological holism, and yet to frame one's identity as within that circumscribed tradition may run the risk of positioning an individual as delimited by the language of kinship and the language of relationality and the language of spirituality and animism. Because those discourses, again, were often used in pejorative terms by white mainstream settler colonial observers to suggest that Native cultures were trapped in a timeless realm of this celebration of animism and ecological relationality. And yet to repurpose that and to say these are means of rethinking our traps, in the traps in which we find ourselves in the face of climate catastrophe, is something that a lot of artists and other makers and writers and historians are doing to claim a position of authority or to deauthorize authority, but to welcome more players into an arena of problem solving or thinking our way out of a problem. So I think this language of kinship is something that is appealing and powerful to a lot of thinkers, but also burdened with the legacy of the way in which animism in general has been pigeonholed.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see if we have some other questions. I don't think we have some right now. So
I could ask
another question. Okay.
No, I think one strategy that has been used by Brazilian indigenous artists, contemporary artists that are like in a lot in the same position, between worlds, that come from communities, but also, went to school, like to universities, are artists, completed artists and all that. I think one of the strategies is kind of try to break the separations between, high art and community art by always trying to really make sure that when their work are exhibited in Brazil, it's also interesting because many, well, I think in the US as well, right? There is also not only artists in the forefront of this movement, but also like Indigenous curators. And they work very close together. They're like a very strong group. And so the idea of always displaying traditional art as art within like a traditional art historical environment. So when we look at Veshoa, the exhibition that curated by NEANE Terena in the Pinacoteca in São Paulo, she uses this, this strategy really clearly, that she does not make any difference between what we call contemporary artists and what we call, craftsmanship or whatever. And she is calling everyone contemporary artists in the sense that you're saying they're not locked in the past. Their culture evolved, but they are, this is what they are producing. And it is as beautiful and legitimate. And although it relates to another code, but they should be seen side by side if you are talking about Indigenous contemporary art. So I'm just wondering if, when I asked about these connections, if that is something that you see happening in
slowly.
Yeah.
Slowly, not as fast as I might like. I was really inspired in putting this talk together by this 2019 show at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts called Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists, which juxtapose makers right now with historical makers and unattributed objects, which have a history of being connected to women, women's knowledge within these defined cultural parameters and domains. And I do think there are some groundbreaking curators in Canada, in the United States as well, particularly in regions that have a very strong history and connection to vibrant, ongoing local Native communities that are very, that have a large population group and that are very vocal. So it's fitting that Hearts of Our People was staged at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts because of the very strong presence of so many Indigenous people within the community who were making contributions to that show. That said, I think a lot of these artists do see themselves as citizens of the world and do see themselves as having these contingent relationships on the boundary between being connected to the past and looking towards the future. And as I said, the ones that I gravitated towards are the ones who have proven themselves to be most accessible, at least for me, because they have a presence, because they have had several individual and group shows and have been getting the critical attention which even 5 or 10 years ago wasn't being given to them. I do think that there's a much stronger presence in Canada in terms of Indigenous curators and Indigenous shows than there is at the moment now in the United States. But I'm happy to say I think that's changing.
Yeah. No, that's great. Because there is something about this strategy that I really like, just a comment of your comment, which is to show that real traditional, like art that is embedded into traditional communities, they also radically evolve. And we can, there are like thousands of examples, where specific, what we call traditional forms have a completely different contemporary look even within the traditional realm. Like I'm thinking about the little Carajá dolls, for instance, in the Brazilian realm, where they had a very specific form and they were incorporated so many elements, but playing within the realms of the traditional communities, of these boundaries, right?
Well, that's why I like something I like about Melissa Cody's work is that in evoking this Germantown Revival style, which was something that was initiated in the 19th century, that demonstrates the ways in which this kind of hybridization is nothing new at all. It has always gone on. It is more a matter of the way in which those discourses were framed by critics and collectors, which in the 19th century all too often were, of course, modernists and anthropologists and Euro-Americans.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because there's something about this group of artists that say, oh, well, you are framing them as dealing with the traditional, which kind of detaches them in a way. You know, it seems almost as if to be contemporary and to be in this place, you have to understand art in like Western terms almost, you know, and play this game within the Western terms. So that's the only, I think, the uncomfortable sort of situation that I see.
It is, and as I acknowledged, I chose my examples quite deliberately to be ones who did play into those kinds of models, because certainly there are plenty of others who can be considered working with various kinds of traditions that are defined very, very differently.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have other questions. A question from José Valtierra. If we think of folklore as a dynamic element that is renewed with each generation, what happens within Indigenous communities with these artistic interpretations and uses? So it was a little bit of what Claudia was already mentioning, but if you can
I would
comment.
say that, you know, with respect to the example of Sean Hunt, they evolve. The figure, you know, trickster Raven, who is a figure of, you know, spiritual and folkloric relevance, becomes something else, becomes a cyborg, becomes a vehicle for virtual reality, and thus the identity of this long-standing, long-cherished trickster figure. I'm so attracted to the idea that the trickster Raven, you know, gets us thinking in different ways about the trickiness of virtual reality itself, and the contingencies of these high-tech interfaces, which are, you know, coming at us so rapidly. And I really admire the way in which he's using that as a framework for really rethinking what how we can think about the most up-to-date and the most advanced technologies. And the kind of collaborations that he's getting into are collaborations with Microsoft and collaborations with, you know, very high-tech fabricators, which seem a very far cry, I think, from how tradition is framed. And so to put on the table the very complete transformation of the idea of tradition itself is something that I'm really pleased to see him doing. I think of Carrie Allison as well, and her QR codes as being very much indebted to that similar kind of radical rethinking of what tradition means, and that what the stories that then can be told are going to evolve as they can and should.
Perfect. Now we have a question from our colleague, Elohio Guzman. Congratulations on this terrific talk and the remarkably vast ground you cover. The work addresses such vast worlds. At what point do you think this artist can be discussed as contemporary artists? And he adds, I mean simply as contemporary artists and not with the qualifier Indigenous artists. Does the label Indigenous artists serve to maintain an other label and diminish their visual innovations?
You know, I think that almost all of them struggle with that. And I think particularly of Jeffrey Gibson, who is so conscious of the way in which labels are othering him all the time. That doesn't stop him from entering into the arena of the art world, wherever it might be found. And because he's working in the 21st century, that demarcates him as a 21st century artist. He and Nicholas Galinan were both included in the 2019 Whitney Biennial, becoming part of a community of many other artists, artists of color, artists who are operating from very many different places, who were all placed in the same framework. Admittedly, a framework that is still delimited by the art world institutions that were founded by and premised on these very Eurocentric models, and yet I think that, you know, that to to deny them the status of contemporary is to do something that's equally unjust as to deny them the possibility of continuing to be indigenous. I think that it's more important to think of ways in which othering is respectful, not pejorative, and that othering is a way that that there can be space, there can be alternate space that's carved out between indigenous and contemporary that doesn't exclude either one, that doesn't deny the possibility of indigeneity and contemporaneity being the same thing. And in the end, I really would like to think of the way in which these artists are setting up models by which everyone, regardless of their background, can think about what tradition means. Because we all have traditions that we're working within, the art historical canon being one. We all have various kinds of ways in which artists are taking background and heritage and custom, are repurposing that. So that's the world that I feel that Jeffrey Gibson and others are seeking to inhabit, and are perhaps making space for that by their more visible presence within the art world. Perfect.
So we have time for one last question, and this is from Sabrina Moura. She's a member of the NEANE study group. And she asks, on this relation to the past tradition, I was wondering how the concept of ancestry is approached by this artist. So you were a little bit touching on that subject.
Yeah, I can't answer that simply and easily, because I don't think there's any one answer. I think, Terry Greaves, for example, is very, very conscious of ancestry as something that she's deliberately doing to give voice to her ancestors. And she says that quite explicitly. And yet I think some of the others would like to distance themselves somewhat from the idea of being contained by one's lineage entirely. Because quite so many of them are, I think, as you may have noticed, they have more than one affiliation. They have more than one history and more than one background. And many of them are of such profound mixed history that's equally indigenous and European, or multiple different indigenous groups that they can claim relation to. So it's not a simple, direct, linear answer.
Thank you. We actually have another question. I don't know if you're willing to take the last question.
One more.
One more, just to finish. So this is Fernando Peixe, and he says, thank you so much for your talk today. I was very intrigued by Sean Hunt's mask you showed us. I was thinking about the tradition of these objects, their ceremonial uses in dances, potlatch ceremonies, and the relation of masks with non-humans and transformations. In this way, some of these masks could be perceived as dangerous objects related to specific supernatural beings. Among the Caritiana, which is an indigenous group from Rondônia in Brazil, bows and arrows are sold as souvenirs and are not real hunting instruments. Caritiana's real arrows are related to snakes and will sought to do harm and are thirsty for blood. So you don't mess with those. So do you know how Hunt works with this perspective of tradition? It looks to me that he's creating a completely different object with different usage, but with similar motifs and shapes.
I wish I could speak more directly to how Hunt negotiates this troubled terrain between this incredibly powerful tradition of these spiritual and supernatural entities with which his nation engages, versus these simulations, for want of a better word. He sees them as interfaces. He sees them as vehicles for potential transformation of a gallery visitor. But whether there are people within his own Heiltsuk nation who are uncomfortable with the way in which he is mobilizing ritual, ceremony, masks, customs that perhaps should remain within that community. I haven't read anything that tells me how his work is being received within that tradition. And I do think he is self-conscious about wanting to create a world of possibility in which transformation is not merely the province of a supernatural entity within Halsuk belief, but knowing that some of the motifs that he's drawing from, some of the designs and patterns, have very deep roots in codes that he doesn't address in the way in which I've seen his work presented in the context of exhibitions. It rings a bell in the back of my mind that makes me curious about how he would answer that question, and I don't yet know. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Emily. I think with that, we conclude our lecture for today. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you to Emily for her time and this amazing presentation and discussion. And we invite you all to our next appointment. We are sending invitations and advertising for our next appointments very soon. So thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, everyone. Bye.